The rhythmic clinking of my wrench against the '68 Mustang's engine block was the only sound in the garage until the heavy steel door groaned open, letting in a blinding beam of afternoon sun. A blast of cold, conditioned air swept across the threshold, cutting through the thick scent of old motor oil and sweat that always hung in the rafters. I didn't look up right away. I kept my grip on the steel tool, applying a steady pressure to the stubborn bolt near the exhaust manifold. My muscles burned with the familiar, comforting ache of hard labor. The sharp, measured click of hard-soled shoes echoed against the concrete floor. One step, then another. The gate belonged to someone who expected the world to step aside for them. I wiped a streak of grease from my cheek with the back of my forearm and finally straightened up, turning my gaze toward the entrance. Richard Vance stood just inside the bay, framed by the silhouette of a massive black limousine parked right in front of my closed sign. He wore a crisp, tailored navy suit that caught the light, without a single wrinkle or speck of dust. A silk tie rested perfectly down the center of his chest. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept over the cracked concrete, the scattered tools, and finally settled on me. A half smile touched the corner of his mouth, the kind of smile a predator reserves for trapped prey. "Arthur Hayes," Richard said. His voice carried a smooth, practiced cadence. He did not extend a hand. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and produced a pristine, glossy folder. "It took some effort to find this place. Not exactly on the city's main registry anymore, is it?" I set my wrench down on the oil-stained workbench. The heavy metal clattered against a pile of rusted washers, the sharp noise ringing in my ears like a warning bell. I picked up a red shop rag, methodically wiping the slick black oil from my calloused fingers. I focused on the rough texture of the fabric against my skin, taking my time as if the extra seconds could delay the inevitable confrontation. "The sign on the door says closed," I said. My voice was steady, but my throat felt tight and dry, carrying the sudden weight of the moment. Richard's smile widened by a fraction of an inch, revealing perfectly white, straight teeth. He took 2 steps closer, stopping just short of a puddle of transmission fluid. Antchef, Nimoji Antral." He held the folder out, hovering it over the clutter of my workbench. "This isn't a social call, old man," he said. "My firm is developing the 6 blocks surrounding this tense establishment. The new supermarket plaza requires adequate parking. Your lot sits exactly in the center of Zone 3. He let go of the folder. It landed with a soft slap onto the greasy surface, right next to a dismantled carburetor. A hollow feeling immediately formed in my chest at the sight of the corporate seal stamped on the cover. "Inside is a buyout offer," Richard continued, adjusting his cuffs. "It's generous. Far more than this dilapidated shed is worth on the open market. We expect you to vacate the premises by the end of the month." I looked at the pristine white folder, now sporting a dark smudge of oil on its corner. I didn't reach for it. I tossed the red rag onto the bench and picked up a rusted spark plug, inspecting the burnt tip. A heavy burden pressed down on my shoulders as the memory of my father building this shop from scrap metal flashed before my eyes. "This shop belonged to my father," I said, my voice barely above a conversational volume, though a bitter taste coated my tongue. "And his father before him. I'm not selling." Richard sighed, an exaggerated exhalation of breath. He checked the gold watch on his left wrist, tapping his index finger against the crystal face. "Let me explain something to you, mechanic," he said, his tone dropping an octave, shedding the polite veneer. "I am not asking. I am offering you a brief window of opportunity to walk away with a little dignity and a check. If you force my hand, I won't just take the land. I will make sure you don't get a single dime for it." He leaned forward slightly, invading the space between us. The scent of an expensive, overpowering cologne washed over the smell of gasoline. "You're standing in the way of progress," he said, his eyes locking onto mine as though he could physically intimidate me. "And progress has a habit of crushing things that don't move." I met his stare. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I placed the spark plug carefully back onto the bench, my movements deliberate and slow to hide the slight tremor in my hands. I reached out, my oil-stained fingers hovering just inches from his pristine suit, and picked up the glossy folder. The sheer arrogance of the man sparked a quiet rage deep in my gut. Richard smirked, giving a curt, satisfied nod. I didn't open it. I turned and walked toward the rusted metal trash barrel sitting in the corner of the bay. I dropped the folder inside, right on top of a pile of used coffee filters and discarded oil rags. The dull thud echoed like a gavel striking wood. I turned back to him, picking up my wrench. The door is behind you, I said. Richard stared at the trash barrel, the smirk slowly melting off his face. The muscles in his jaw flexed, grinding together. The smooth, calculated composure fractured for just a second, revealing a flash of raw, unfiltered malice. He adjusted his silk tie, his fingers twitching slightly in pure anger. You're making a catastrophic mistake, crazy old fool, he spat, his voice tight. Enjoy the silence while it lasts. The city inspectors are already reviewing your outdated permits. We'll see if you're still this stubborn when the bulldozers arrive tomorrow morning. He spun on his heel, his hard-soled shoes cracking against the concrete. He walked out of the bay, the heavy steel door swinging shut behind him. The engine of the limousine roared to life, shaking the windows, before tires squealed against the asphalt, fading into the distance. I stood alone in the dim garage. The beam of sunlight slowly shifted across the floor, highlighting the thick layer of dust on my father's old tool chest. I picked up a shop rag, my knuckles turning white as I squeezed the rough fabric. The sudden loss of my peaceful sanctuary hit me, leaving nothing but the anticipation of a brutal war. The silence of the shop felt different now, no longer a haven, but a suffocating trap closing in around me. I threw the rag onto the bench, my gaze locked on the heavy steel doors, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. The silence of the shop felt different now, no longer a haven, but a suffocating trap closing in around me. I threw the rag onto the bench, my gaze locked on the heavy steel doors, waiting for the inevitable storm to break. That storm returned without warning, as the steel door shrieked back open, scraping loud against the concrete. Richard Vance stepped right back across the threshold. The facade of the polite, calculating businessman had evaporated. He did not walk with the same measured, arrogant stride. He marched, his hard-soled shoes hammered against the floor like a drumbeat of war. His tailored navy suit still caught the afternoon sunlight, but the man inside it was unraveling. A deep, dark shade of red crept up from his collar, coloring his neck and jawline. He stopped a few feet away from my workbench, taking deep breaths. "You think you are clever, old man," Richard spat. The smooth cadence of his voice was gone, replaced by a harsh, grating rasp. "You think throwing a piece of paper in the garbage makes the reality go away?" I didn't answer at first. I turned my body toward him. I wiped my hands on my jeans, the coarse denim scratching against my calluses. The sheer audacity of his return sparked a slow-burning rage deep in my chest. It was not the sudden, fiery anger of a young man. It was the cold, heavy weight of a man who had spent a lifetime building something, only to have a stranger demand it for pennies. "I think my answer was clear," I said. My voice was a low rumble echoing off the brick walls. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. He ran a hand through his styled hair, disrupting the neat part. He looked around the garage, his eyes darting across the rusted tool chests, the hydraulic lift, and the half-assembled engine of the Mustang. His gaze was frantic, searching for leverage in a place he despised. "Clear?" he repeated, taking another step forward. The scent of his expensive cologne clashed with the sharp tang of metal shavings and old gasoline. "Let me make things clear for you, mechanic. My firm does not ask polite questions and walk away when a stubborn relic refuses to budge. We do not take no for an answer." I reached down to the lower shelf of my workbench. My fingers brushed past a pile of discarded spark plugs and closed around the cold, textured steel of a heavy crowbar. I did not raise it. I gripped it, letting the solid mass anchor me. The metal felt like a natural extension of my arm. "The offer in the trash was the nice version," Richard continued, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. He pointed a manicured finger straight at my chest. "Do you have any idea how easy it is to condemn a building like this? One anonymous call to the city planner. A surprise fire inspection. Old wiring has a terrible habit of sparking, doesn't it?" He paused, letting the threat hang in the dusty air between us, as if he had just dropped a lit match into a pool of fuel. "Accidents happen to old, dilapidated buildings all the time," he said, his lips curling into a vicious sneer, "especially when they stand in the middle of a multi-million-dollar development zone. It would be a terrible shame if you lost everything and walked away with nothing. The hollow threat echoed in the large space. It was a cowardly tactic, the kind of intimidation used by men who had never fought for anything with their own two hands. He expected fear. He expected me to cower, to beg, to desperately cling to a shred of hope that he might show mercy. I stepped out from behind the workbench. I held the heavy crowbar at my side, my grip tight enough that my knuckles turned bone white. I did not raise the weapon, but I did not hide it either. I walked with deliberate steps toward him, my heavy work boots making no sound against the grease-stained concrete. Richard stopped talking. His eyes dropped to the steel bar in my hand, then flicked back up to my face. The red flush on his neck began to recede, replaced by a stark paleness. He took a subtle half-step backward, his polished shoe slipping on a patch of dried oil. I stopped when I was less than 2 feet away from him. I towered over him, my broad shoulders blocking out the beam of sunlight streaming through the doorway. I looked down into his eyes, letting the absolute certainty of my resolve radiate from my posture. Emotion. "You listen to me with open ears," I said. I did not yell. I did not need to. The quiet intensity in my voice was more dangerous than a scream. This shop is my life. It was my father's life. It is not for sale, not for money, not for threats. I took one more deliberate step forward, forcing him to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. The air between us felt thick, charged with an invisible electricity as though a storm was about to break. "If an inspector comes here, I will deal with him," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "If a fire starts, I will put it out. But if you, or anyone from your firm, ever steps foot in my garage again, you will find out what happens to things that stand in my way." I did not blink. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to absorb the raw truth of my words. There was no bluff in my eyes, no hidden agenda, only the pure determination of a man defending his territory. I felt a sudden pang of deep sorrow for the lengths I might have to go to protect my legacy, but that sorrow was buried beneath a mountain of unwavering resolve. Richard stared at me. The arrogant smirk was gone. His jaw trembled. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to issue one final retort, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the crowbar, then back at my face. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his silk collar. He took another step back, then another, creating distance between us. Without a single word, he turned and fled toward the entrance. He did not look back. I stood in the center of the bay, watching him disappear into the bright afternoon glare. The heavy burden of the impending conflict settled onto my shoulders, a physical ache that I knew would remain. I lowered the crowbar, the cold steel grounding me against the rising tide of war. Emotion. 3 days after Richard Vance walked out of my garage, the first blow landed, not from a fist or a wrecking ball, but from a bright yellow sticker pressed against my front window by a man who wouldn't meet my eyes. I had been under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's old Buick when the front door swung open with a sharp crack. A stocky man in a pressed khaki shirt and a white hard hat stepped across the threshold, carrying a metal clipboard and a roll of adhesive labels. The embroidered patch on his chest read, "City of Millbrook, Code Enforcement." He didn't greet me. He didn't ask if I was the owner. He walked straight to the front window, peeled the backing off a large, garish yellow sticker, and slapped it against the glass with the palm of his hand. The wet sound echoed through the silent garage. I pulled my head out from under the Buick's hood and wiped my hands on a rag. I walked toward him, my work boots scuffing against the concrete. "Can I help you?" I asked. The inspector turned. He was a man in his mid-40s, with a thick neck and deep-set eyes that seemed to focus on a point somewhere past my left shoulder. He held up his metal clipboard like a shield. "Arthur Hayes?" he asked. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection, as if he had rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror. "That's me. I'm Inspector Davis, City Code Enforcement. We've received a complaint regarding multiple safety violations at this address." He flipped a page on his clipboard and began reading from a printed list. "Outdated electrical wiring not compliant with the 2019 NEC revision. Insufficient fire suppression systems. Hazardous material storage violations, specifically improper containment of motor oil, transmission fluid and aerosol solvents. Structural concerns regarding the load-bearing capacity of the eastern wall." Each item landed like a hammer blow to my chest. I had operated this shop for over 30 years. My father had operated it for 20 before that. Emotion. No inspector had ever set foot inside this building with a list like that. "This is a licensed auto repair shop," I said. I kept my voice level, though a burning pressure was building behind my sternum. "I have every permit on file. I passed my last inspection 14 months ago." Inspector Davis didn't look up from his clipboard. He clicked a ballpoint pen and made a small mark on his paper. "Standards change, Mr. Hayes," he said. The rehearsed flatness of his tone was infuriating, a wall of bureaucratic apathy designed to deflect any argument. "The current code requires a full reassessment. I'm authorized to issue a cease and desist order on any heavy machinery until these violations are remedied." My hands balled into fists at my sides. My knuckles ached from the pressure. "You can't just shut down my business over a complaint," I said. "Who filed this?" "Complaints are confidential, sir." He didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. The answer came out like a preloaded cartridge. I stared at him, searching his face for any crack, any sign that he was aware of the absurdity of what he was doing. His deep-set eyes remained fixed on that invisible point past my shoulder. A thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead, despite the cool temperature inside the garage. His fingers gripped the metal clipboard with more force than necessary, the tendons in his wrist standing out like cables. He was afraid, not of me, of whoever had sent him. Inspector Davis turned away from me and walked toward the heavy machinery area. He stopped in front of the hydraulic lift, the air compressor, and the old welding station my father had bolted to the concrete slab decades ago. He pulled a small red tag from his clipboard, the kind used to mark equipment for lockout. "What are you doing?" I asked, taking a step forward. "Tagging non-compliant equipment for immediate lockout," he said. He reached behind the main power panel on the eastern wall, the one that fed electricity to every piece of heavy machinery in the bay. Without looking at me, he flipped the master breaker. The hydraulic lift groaned and sank an inch. The overhead fluorescent tubes buzzed once, then went dark. The constant hum of the air compressor, a sound I had heard every day of my working life, a sound so familiar it was like a heartbeat, died. The only light left was the thin grey beam leaking through the grimy windows and the bright yellow violation sticker glowing on the front glass. The silence was suffocating. It pressed against my eardrums, filling the space where mechanical noise had lived for half a century. I stood in the middle of my own shop, surrounded by tools I could no longer use, staring at the dark outlines of machines that had built my life. Inspector Davis tucked his clipboard under his arm and walked toward the exit. He paused at the door, his back still to me. "You have 30 days to address the violations and schedule a re-inspection," he said, his voice carrying a faint tremor that the rehearsed flatness couldn't quite conceal. "Failure to comply will result in permanent closure and potential demolition authorization." The door closed behind him with a soft click. I stood in the dark. The grey light from the windows cast long, distorted shadows across the floor, making the familiar shapes of my workbenches and tool chests look alien and hostile. The smell of old motor oil, normally a comfort, now carried the bitter tang of something decaying. I reached out and placed my hand on the cold, dead surface of the hydraulic lift. The metal was already cooling, losing the warmth it always carried when it was alive and working. Richard Vance's words echoed in the silence. Accidents happen to old buildings. He hadn't needed an accident. He had used the city itself as his weapon, turning the system I had trusted and paid into for 3 decades against me with a single phone call. The sheer reach of it, the speed, the precision, the complete absence of any avenue for me to fight back, settled onto my shoulders like a physical weight, a grinding burden that made my knees ache. I pulled a stool out from under the workbench, sat down in the dark, and stared at the bright yellow sticker glowing on my window. The anger was there, deep and hot, but it was buried under something heavier, a crushing exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones when you realize the fight ahead is far bigger than you anticipated. Emotion. The garage was dark and cold without power, the air stale and thick with the smell of standing oil. When the front door opened and a shaft of bright sunlight framed Sarah's silhouette in the entrance, she stood there for a moment, her designer bag hanging from one elbow, her other hand resting on the doorframe, as if she were bracing herself against contamination. The sharp clack of her heels echoed against the dead concrete as she stepped inside, each step cautious and measured, avoiding the grease stains on the floor with surgical precision. "Dad," she said. Her voice carried a forced warmth, the kind of sweetness that coated the surface of a conversation while hiding something sharp underneath. "I heard about the inspection. I came as soon as I could." I was sitting on the same stool where I had spent the last 3 days, my back against the cold workbench, my hands idle for the first time in decades. The yellow violation sticker still glowed on the front window, catching the afternoon light. I looked up at her. Sarah was 32, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She wore a cream-colored blouse and fitted slacks that cost more than a week of my revenue. Her eyes scanned the dark garage the way a real estate agent surveys a condemned property, calculating square footage. "Thanks for coming," I said. My voice was rough, unused. I cleared my throat. Sarah set her bag down on the cleanest corner of my workbench, pushing aside a stack of old invoices with 2 fingers. She pulled a chair over from the small office nook, my dead son's old desk chair, the one with the cracked leather seat, and sat down across from me. She crossed her legs, her posture straight and controlled. "How bad is it?" she asked. "They cut the power to every piece of heavy equipment," I said. 30-day compliance window. The violation list is a page and a half long. Half of it is fabricated. Sarah nodded. She didn't look surprised. She didn't ask who had filed the complaint. She didn't ask how I was holding up. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim, leather-bound folder. She placed it on the workbench between us with a soft tap. The folder looked expensive, new, the kind of thing that came from a law office, not a concerned daughter-in-law. Emotion. "Dad, I've been doing some research," she said. Her tone shifted, shedding the forced warmth like a snake shedding old skin. What remained was brisk, efficient, transactional. The compliance costs alone will run you over $60,000. New wiring, fire suppression, structural reinforcement. You're looking at a minimum of 4 months of construction. The shop will be closed the entire time. You have no income during that period. She paused, letting the numbers hang in the stale air between us. Her eyes met mine, and behind them I saw no concern, no empathy, just the cold mechanics of a calculation being executed. "The offer from Vance Properties is still on the table," she continued. "I spoke with their legal team this morning. They're willing to increase the buyout to $450,000. That is a generous number, Dad. More than fair for this location." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. The words hit me like a physical blow, but not because of their content, because of their source. This was my son's wife, the woman who had stood beside my boy at the altar, who had promised to be part of this family, and she had already spoken to Richard Vance's lawyers. She had already negotiated a price. "You spoke to Vance's people," I said. It was not a question. Sarah didn't flinch. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "Someone had to be practical, Dad," she said. The word practical landed like a slap. "You are sitting in the dark in a building that the city is about to condemn, refusing to face reality. I have bills. Danny's medical debts are still outstanding. The kids need new school supplies. This shop," she gestured around the dark garage with a sweep of her hand, her manicured nails catching the dim light. "This shop is not worth dying on a hill for." I stared at her hand, the one with the manicured nails and the thin gold bracelet that had not been there last month. I stared at the leather folder, at the crisp, professional documents inside it. She had come prepared. She had come with numbers, with arguments, with a pen. She reached into the folder and pulled out a ballpoint pen, black, with a silver clip. She placed it on top of the papers, aligning it with the signature line. "Just sign it, Dad," she said. Her voice softened, but the softness was hollow, an echo of warmth without any heat behind it. "Take the money, move to a smaller place, let it go." I looked at the pen on the paper. I looked at the yellow sticker on the window. I looked at Sarah, at the woman my son had loved, and a profound, hollow grief opened up inside my chest like a sinkhole. It was not the kind of grief that burns or rages. It was the kind that drains, a vast, empty ache that pulls everything downward, leaving nothing but a cold, dark space where warmth used to live. The physical threats from Richard Vance, the inspectors, the power cuts, the thinly veiled promises of arson, those were weapons I could see, could measure, could fight. But this, my own family, standing in my dead shop, handing me a pen to sign away my father's legacy. This was a blade I never saw coming, pushed in from a direction I had never thought to guard. "Get out," I said. My voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. The words scraped against my dry throat. Sarah blinked. Her composure cracked for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something crossing her face, too fast to identify. She stood up, smoothed the front of her blouse, and picked up her bag. "The pen stays on the desk," she said. "When you are ready to be reasonable, call me." She walked toward the door, her heels marking a slow, measured retreat across the concrete. She did not look back. The heavy steel door swung shut behind her, cutting off the shaft of sunlight and plunging the garage back into its cold, permanent dark. I sat on my stool and stared at the empty doorway. The pen lay on the papers, gleaming in the dim light. The grief settled into my bones, heavy and permanent, filling the space where trust used to live. I reached over and pushed the leather folder off the edge of the workbench. It hit the floor with a dull thud, scattering papers across the grease-stained concrete. I sat in the dark, alone, surrounded by the ghosts of a family that no longer existed. Emotion. The harsh, electronic beep of the declined credit card terminal cut through the hum of Henderson's auto supply, a sound that drove an ice-cold spike directly into the center of my chest. I stood at the register with a replacement fuel pump and a case of 10-40 motor oil resting on the counter. The young clerk, a girl no older than 20, with a smattering of freckles across her nose, stared at the small LCD screen with an expression of wide-eyed discomfort. "Could you try it again?" I asked. My voice emerged steady, betraying none of the sudden panic rising in my throat. I had $300 in that account. I had checked the balance only 2 days ago. It was the account I used to keep the shop breathing, the financial bloodline of my father's legacy. She swiped the worn Visa card a second time. The machine paused, blinked, and emitted the same sharp, accusing screech. The word DCAANE'd flashed in bright red capital letters, burning into my retinas. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," the clerk murmured. A flush of deep pink spread across her cheeks. She extended the plastic card toward me with 2 fingers, treating it like a piece of hazardous material. "It says insufficient funds, or perhaps a sudden freeze on the account. You might need to call your bank." Behind me, the shuffle of work boots against the linoleum floor suddenly ceased. The silence in the line stretched into an agonizing eternity. 2 other customers, regulars, men I had exchanged nods with for 15 years, stared intently at the ceiling, the floor tiles, anywhere to avoid the raw humiliation radiating from my position. The air in the store, heavy with the scent of rubber and chemical brake fluid, suddenly became suffocating. The fluorescent lights overhead pressed down on my shoulders, exposing my failure under their clinical glare. I took the card back. My fingers gripped the plastic edge tight enough to turn my knuckles white. A suffocating pressure coiled tightly around my ribcage, squeezing the oxygen from my lungs. The sting of public humiliation burned in my throat like swallowed ash. I slid the card into my wallet, turned my back on the fuel pump, and walked out the glass doors without uttering a single word. The morning air hit my face, cold and indifferent, but it offered no relief from the crushing dread settling in my gut. I climbed into the cabin of my beat-up Ford truck and slammed the door. My hands gripped the cracked leather of the steering wheel. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number for First National Bank of Millbrook. My father had opened our business account there in 1972. It was an institution built on trust, a place that held the financial history of my entire adult life. The line rang 4 times before an automated voice answered. 12 agonizing minutes of distorted jazz hold music followed. I stared blindly at the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my temples. The agony of waiting stretched my nerves until they hummed with tension. Finally, a human voice replaced the music. "First National Bank, this is Angela. How may I assist you today?" "My name is Arthur Hayes, account number ending in 4471. My card was just declined, and I need to know why." There was money in that account. A pause followed. The rapid, mechanical clatter of a keyboard echoed through the speaker. "Mr. Hayes, I am reviewing your file now." Angela's voice carried a measured, corporate caution that immediately sent a fresh wave of terror crashing through my stomach. "It appears a corporate lien has been placed on all accounts associated with Hayes Auto Repair. The lien was filed by Vance Properties LLC, pursuant to a preliminary judgment from the Millbrook County Civil Court." The words struck me like a physical blow to the jaw. A corporate lien on all my accounts. Not just the business ledger, all of them. The savings account my wife and I had built together. The small emergency fund I kept for groceries. Every dollar I had scraped together through 30 years of backbreaking labor, frozen. "A lien," I rasped. The voice did not sound like my own. It sounded hollow, broken, scraped clean of strength. "I haven't received any court papers. I haven't been served." "Sir, I understand your distress," Angela replied, her tone tightening into a defensive script. The lien was filed as an emergency motion. I'll see my fee to den it. It acts as a temporary hold pending resolution. I do not have the legal authority to release any funds. You must contact the filing party to resolve this. The filing party is the corporation attempting to steal my land, I said, the bitter taste of despair coating my tongue. Another pause. Longer, heavier. I am truly sorry, Mr. Hayes. There is nothing I can do from this terminal. Is there anything else? I ended the call. The phone slipped from my grasp, landing heavily on my thigh. The engine remained off. The sun climbed higher over the strip mall, heating the cabin until the air grew stale and stifling. My hands remained locked on the steering wheel, the tendons standing out like rigid cables under my scarred skin. Richard Vance had not simply threatened the brick and mortar of my shop. He had reached his manicured hands into the veins of my existence and clamped them shut. The garage was dark, the power was cut, and now the money, the lifeblood of my survival, was locked away behind an impenetrable legal fortress. I opened the glove compartment. My fingers rummaged past old registration papers until they found a faded envelope. My late wife's handwriting graced the cover. Inside sat a single crisp $20 bill, my absolute last reserve. I smoothed the bill against the steering wheel, staring at the green ink through a sudden, blinding haze of sorrow. The crushing weight of the betrayal pressed down on my spine, bowing my shoulders forward. The humiliation of the declined card, the polite apathy of the bank, the invisible fingers of a billionaire squeezing the breath out of my life, it all coalesced into an unbearable, suffocating mass. I turned the ignition key, the old engine coughed and roared to life. My hands gripped the wheel with a desperate, white-knuckled force that made the joints ache. I pulled out of the parking lot, navigating the grey streets with nothing but $20 and a heart heavy with absolute devastation. Emotion. Rain streaked down the windshield of my beat-up Ford truck in thick, uneven rivulets, blurring the world outside into a wash of grey and neon. I was parked across the street from a high-end cafe downtown, the kind of place with brass handles on the doors and handwritten menus in French. I had no business being here. I had come to the bank on Main Street to appeal the lien in person, only to be turned away at the front desk by a security guard who said my appointment had been cancelled. On my way back to the truck, I had spotted a cream-colored blouse through the cafe's rain-streaked window. Sarah's blouse. I killed the engine and sat in the dark cabin, the wipers frozen mid-arc, the rain hammering the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Through the blurred glass, I could make out the warm, golden interior of the cafe, small round tables draped in white linen, candles flickering in glass holders. And there, at a table near the back, sat my daughter-in-law. Sarah was not alone. Across from her sat a man I did not recognize at first, young, early 30s, with slicked back hair and a dark grey suit that fit him like a second skin. He leaned back in his chair with the loose, confident posture of someone who was used to being in control. A thin leather briefcase sat on the seat beside him. It took me several seconds to place him. I had seen his face once before, standing 2 steps behind Richard Vance during the first visit to my shop. His assistant, his handler, they were laughing. Sarah threw her head back, her dark ponytail swinging, and the sound of her laughter, muffled by the rain and the glass between us, reached my ears as a faint, distorted echo. The man raised a champagne flute. Sarah raised hers. The 2 glasses clinked together with a delicate, cheerful sound that cut through the noise of the storm. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The old leather groaned under my grip. I watched, motionless, as the man reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He placed it on the white tablecloth and slid it across the table towards Sarah with 2 fingers, a casual, practiced motion, like he had done this 100 times before. Sarah picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She weighed it in her hand, actually weighed it, bouncing it in her palm to judge the thickness, and then slid it into her designer bag with the smooth efficiency of a card dealer pocketing a tip. She smiled at the man, a wide, genuine smile that I had never seen her direct at me, not once in the 8 years she had been part of my family. The scene played out behind the rain-streaked glass like a silent film, stripped of dialogue and reduced to its raw, ugly mechanics. A transaction. My daughter-in-law was being paid by the same people who had cut the power to my shop, frozen my bank accounts, and threatened to bulldoze the building my father had built with his bare hands. She wasn't a bystander caught in the crossfire. She wasn't a pragmatist making the best of a bad situation. She was an active participant, a willing collaborator who had sold me out for the price of a thick envelope and a glass of champagne. The rain hammered harder against the windshield. The wipers stayed frozen. The world outside continued to blur, but the image inside the cafe remained sharp and clear in my mind, burned into my retinas with the permanence of a brand. Emotion. I pressed my forehead against the cold steering wheel. The vinyl was damp with condensation, chilling the skin of my brow. My breathing was shallow, tight, each exhale fogging the glass in front of me. The grief I had carried since the night of the inspection, the hollow, draining ache, was changing. It was hardening, contracting, collapsing inward like a dying star compressing into something dense and infinitely more dangerous. The hope I had been carrying, the small, stubborn hope that Sarah had been merely misguided, that she had simply been scared by the financial pressure and made a bad judgment call, that hope died in the warm glow of the cafe, drowned in champagne and sealed in a manila envelope. What replaced it was not rage, not yet. It was something colder, something sharper, a clear, surgical understanding that I was not fighting a bully or a greedy corporation. I was fighting a coordinated conspiracy, and the conspiracy included the woman who slept under my roof, who ate at my table, who called me dad while counting the dollars she would receive for my ruin. I lifted my head from the steering wheel. Through the fogged glass, I could still see Sarah's silhouette inside the cafe, leaning forward, speaking with an animated enthusiasm that she never showed at home. The man across from her was taking notes on a small pad. I turned the ignition key. The old engine coughed and caught, the vibration traveling through the frame and into my bones. I pulled away from the curb without turning on my headlights, letting the rain and the dark swallow the truck whole. Behind me, the golden glow of the cafe shrank to a pinpoint and disappeared. I drove through the empty streets, the rain pounding the windshield, and for the first time since Richard Vance had walked into my garage, my hands on the steering wheel were not trembling, they were steady, locked. The grief was still there, deep and permanent, but it was no longer the only thing living inside my chest. Something else had taken root, something cold and patient, coiling around my spine like a steel cable, waiting for its moment to pull tight. Emotion. I tore through the metal filing cabinet in the back office of the garage with the frantic urgency of a man digging through rubble for survivors. Old receipts, oil change records, faded manuals and yellowed insurance forms flew onto the floor in crumpled heaps. My fingers, still black with engine grease, clawed through decades of paperwork, searching for the one document that mattered. The manila envelope was at the bottom of the third drawer, wedged behind a stack of tax returns from the early 90s. I had not touched it in over 5 years. There had never been a reason to. The deed to 417 Prospect Avenue, my father's name at the top, my name below it, signed over to me in 1998 after his stroke, had lived in that envelope undisturbed since the day I filed it. I pulled it out. The envelope was lighter than I remembered. The flap was unsealed, the adhesive strip curling away from the paper as if it had been opened and resealed multiple times. A cold dread pooled in the pit of my stomach. I turned the envelope over. A small circular notary stamp, fresh, crisp, and impossibly recent, was pressed into the bottom right corner of the flap. I opened it. Inside was not my deed. Inside was a single multi-page document printed on heavy legal stock, bound with a blue backing. The header read, Ma Gij Transfer and Lien Assignment, Millbrook County Recorder's Office. The property address was mine. The description of the lot was mine. Lot 47, Block 12, Section 3, Prospect Avenue Industrial Corridor. But the name on the transfer line was not mine. It read, Vance Properties LLC, Principal Assignee. I flipped to the last page. My hand was shaking so hard that the paper rattled against the metal edge of the filing cabinet. Emotion. At the bottom of the page, on the signature line marked Property Owner, sat a signature. My signature, my scrawl, the looping A, the sharp cross of the H, the trailing tail of the S, rendered in blue ink with a steady, confident hand. Except I had never signed this document. I had never seen this document. I had never authorized any transfer of any kind. I held the paper closer to the dim light leaking through the office's single grimy window. The signature was good. It was a near-perfect reproduction of my handwriting, the proportions, the spacing, the pressure points. But it was not mine. The pen strokes were too smooth, too controlled. My hands had not been steady in years. The arthritis in my right wrist produced a faint tremor that left micro-irregularities in every letter I wrote. This signature had none of those. Sarah had watched me sign checks at the kitchen table for 8 years. She had seen my handwriting on birthday cards, on grocery lists, on the backs of envelopes. She had access to the house, to the office, to the filing cabinet. She had a key. The paper slipped from my trembling fingers. It fluttered to the oily concrete floor, landing face up, the forged signature staring back at me like an accusation. I watched it fall. I did not pick it up. I sank onto the edge of the old metal desk, my weight pressing down on the corner until the rivets groaned. My legs buckled under me, not from physical exhaustion, but from the sheer crushing mass of the betrayal settling onto my frame. My father had bought this land in 1961 with money he earned hauling scrap metal. He had poured the concrete foundation himself, on his hands and knees, in the August heat. He had hung the first sign, Hayes Auto Repair, with a hammer and 3 bent nails, standing on the roof of his Ford Bronco because he couldn't afford a ladder. And now it was gone. Signed away with a forgery, notarized with a stamp that someone had purchased for $20 at the county clerk's office. My sanctuary, the building where I had learned to change oil at 9 years old, where I had rebuilt my first engine at 14, where I had mourned my wife and buried my grief in the honest labor of my hands, had been stolen, not by force, not by a court order, by ink and paper and the cold calculation of a woman who called me Dad. I sat on the desk for a long time. The grey light from the window shifted as clouds passed overhead, painting moving shadows across the stacks of receipts scattered on the floor. The silence of the powerless garage pressed in from every direction, no longer just quiet but actively hostile, a void that swallowed sound and hope in equal measure. My right hand hung at my side, trembling with the same micro-irregularities that my forged signature did not have. I stared at that hand, calloused, scarred, stained with decades of grease and hard work, and a profound physical ache spread through my chest, as if the loss were a wound opening in the center of my ribcage. Everything I had built, everything my father had built, everything that connected me to the history of this patch of dirt, all of it, reduced to a blue-backed legal document lying face up on the oily floor. I did not cry. The grief was too vast, too deep for tears. It was the kind of devastation that goes beyond emotion and settles into the structure of your bones, reshaping the way you carry yourself, the way you breathe, the way you exist in a world that has just been fundamentally rearranged. The forged deed lay on the floor. I stepped over it and walked out of the office, into the dark, dead bay of my father's garage, and stood there, surrounded by silent machines and cold tools, with nothing left to lose. Emotion. The blare of police sirens shattered the quiet morning like a sledgehammer through plate glass, tearing through the thin metal walls of the garage with an agonizing screech. I stood in the dead center of the bay, surrounded by silent machines and cold tools, as the pulsing wail ripped the remaining silence to shreds. My hands, stained with decades of grease, trembled against the sides of my jeans. The sudden shrill noise drove an ice-cold spike of dread directly into my sternum. I walked toward the front window, my boots dragging against the concrete like lead weights. The yellow violation sticker clung to the glass, a bright, mocking emblem of my destruction. I peeled back the edge. The morning light was grey and unforgiving, painting the cracked asphalt of my lot in dismal shadows. 3 police cruisers barricaded the entrance, their red and blue lights spinning in a frantic, blinding rotation. The strobe effect washed over the neighboring buildings in alternating waves of fire and ice. Behind them, a white panel van bearing the seal of the Millbrook County Sheriff's Civil Division idled in the street. 2 armed deputies stepped from the lead cruiser, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They moved with the stiff, rehearsed authority of men preparing for conflict. And standing safely behind them, his hands tucked neatly into the pockets of a charcoal overcoat, was Richard Vance. He wore a smile, not a predatory grin, but a relaxed, utterly satisfied expression, the kind of smile worn by a man watching a conquered enemy burn. In his right hand he clutched a folded piece of heavy parchment, the gold county seal catching the red and blue flashes from the cruisers. I pushed the front door open. The morning air hit my face, sharp and biting with the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust fumes. The sirens abruptly cut off. The resulting silence rang in my ears, an unnatural vacuum that pressed down on my shoulders with suffocating force. The lead deputy, a tall man with a square, impassive jaw, stepped forward, the heavy parchment fluttered in his grip. "Mr. Arthur Hayes." The voice was flat, mechanical, stripped of any human sympathy. "That's me. I possess a court-ordered eviction notice, signed by Judge Harlan of the Millbrook County Civil Court. The property located at 417 Prospect Avenue has been remanded to Vance Properties LLC pursuant to a valid mortgage transfer. You are required to vacate these premises within." The deputy consulted his heavy silver watch. 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 50 years of my father's sweat, my late wife's sacrifices, my son's memories, compressed into 5 agonizing minutes. I stared at the deputy. A crushing wave of absolute devastation slammed into my chest, knocking the breath from my lungs. The agony of the moment tore through my nerves, a visceral, blinding pain that possessed physical mass and gravity. Richard Vance took a deliberate step closer, his smile widening into a mask of pure, ecstatic cruelty. "Good morning, mechanic," Richard called out. His voice carried a cheerful, lilting cadence that sent a rush of boiling fury searing through my veins. "I warned you that progress crushes things that refuse to move. You should have taken the money." I did not utter a single word in response. I turned my back on his mocking face and walked into the dark cavern of the garage. 5 minutes. I stood under the unlit fluorescent tubes and looked at the ruins of my life. The hydraulic lift, frozen in death. The air compressor, silent and cold. The rows of snap-on wrenches, polished every Sunday morning for 30 years, hanging neatly on the pegboard. The old Mustang, patiently waiting for a restoration that would never come. My father's tool chest, a massive dented red Craftsman purchased in 1967. I did not pack a bag. I did not gather the diagnostic scanners or the expensive air guns. I walked to the heavy red chest, opened the top drawer, and removed 2 specific items. First, a single 12-inch combination wrench, the very first tool my father had ever pressed into my young hands. Second, a faded photograph enclosed in a cracked plastic frame. A picture of a younger me, standing with my arm around my 9-year-old son, grinning into the sun. I slid the photograph into my breast pocket, pressing it tightly against my heart. I gripped the cold steel of the wrench in my right hand. The metal bit sharply into my calloused palm. I crossed the threshold for the final time. The deputies stepped aside, their eyes carefully avoiding mine. Richard Vance barked a command, directing 2 men from the panel van toward the rolling steel door. They carried a massive industrial padlock and a heavy steel chain. The chain rattled through the door handles with a deafening metallic shriek. The padlock snapped shut. The sharp, decisive click echoed across the empty lot, a sound that severed my past from my present with the finality of a guillotine blade. I stood on the sidewalk, entirely stripped of my sanctuary. The cold morning wind tugged at my jacket. Down the street, an idling silver sedan sat parked against the curb. Through the windshield, I spotted Sarah. She sat rigidly in the passenger seat, immediately turning her face away to stare blankly at the passing traffic. She did not open the door. She did not wave. The treacherous ghost of my family disappeared behind tinted glass. Richard Vance stepped past me, close enough that the scent of his expensive cologne invaded my nostrils. He leaned in. "Enjoy retirement, old man," he whispered. He walked to his waiting limousine and departed. The cruisers pulled away. The street emptied, leaving the padlocked garage standing silent and dead, a sealed tomb for everything I had ever loved. I stared at the heavy padlock. I looked down at the wrench in my hand. The peaceful, humble mechanic who had endured the insults and swallowed the humiliation died in that exact moment. The victim was gone. The agonizing grief burned away, leaving only a cold, terrifying fury coiling around my spine like a tightening steel cable. The silence of the morning broke, replaced by the steady, unyielding hum of a man preparing for war. The relentless, freezing rain soaked through the thin, porous fabric of my dark jacket, turning the neon-lit street into a blinding wash of slate gray as I sat alone on the rusted metal bench of a deserted bus stop. 3 blocks away, my father's legacy stood sealed behind a heavy, metallic industrial padlock, stripped from my grease-stained hands by the cruel mechanics of corporate greed. The cold downpour hammered the corrugated tin roof of the shelter, a deafening rhythmic drumbeat that completely drowned out the steady, painful thud of my own heartbeat. Ice-cold water ran down my neck in freezing streams, pooling in the heavy, rough creases of my blue denim jeans and filling my leather work boots until my thick wool socks squelched wetly with every minor shift of my weight. I did not attempt to find cover from the leaking roof. The freezing water offered a sharp, biting physical sensation that briefly distracted from the suffocating, burning agony expanding inside my chest. The bitter scent of wet asphalt, ozone and diesel exhaust hung thick in the damp air. The bus stop bench was rusted entirely through in two separate places. The bright green paint peeled away to reveal rough, corroded brown metal underneath, flaking off like dead skin. A faded advertisement for a local dental clinic was bolted to the back panel, the smiling face of a blonde woman with impossibly bright white teeth grinning at the empty, flooded street. I stared at the peeling green paint, the muddy water splashing against the dark leather of my boots, the slate-grey sky pressing down like a solid concrete ceiling. I reached into my damp breast pocket. My calloused, scarred fingers plunged into the wet cotton fabric, shaking violently as they closed around the hard, cracked plastic frame. I pulled the photograph out into the dim grey light. The smooth protective glass was slick with moisture, the yellowed paper edges curling inward, but the vivid image behind the transparent barrier remained agonizingly clear. My son Daniel, 23 years old in the picture, standing proudly in front of the wide-open bay doors of the garage, with a heavy silver wrench clutched in his right hand. A dark smear of black engine grease marked his chin, and he grinned with the exact same lopsided, carefree smile his mother used to wear. He had been dead for 4 excruciating years now, a sudden blood clot that traveled from his leg to his lung in the dead of night, snatching him away before the red and blue flashing lights of the ambulance could even reach the driveway. Daniel was the sole reason I had tolerated Sarah. He had loved her with a pure, unblemished devotion, and for his sake, I had opened my home and my heart to a woman who viewed both exclusively as assets to be liquidated. After he died, I kept the door wide open because I still desperately searched for echoes of his bright face in hers, still listened for fragments of his loud laughter in the way she moved through our sunlit kitchen. But those echoes were treacherous lies. They had always been lies. I gripped the photograph in both hands. The cold rain ran over the smooth glass in thin, wavering lines, distorting Daniel's face and making him shimmer as if he were submerged underwater in a dark lake. My chest ached with a profound, tearing sorrow, a grief so bottomless and so old that it had calcified into a permanent part of my anatomy. It felt as though a second skeleton made entirely of absolute loss had grown inside me, holding me upright while simultaneously crushing me under its immense, suffocating weight. "I'm sorry, Daniel," I whispered to the empty, flooded street. The harsh words cracked and broke in my dry throat, barely escaping the tight knot of misery that threatened to choke me. "I'm sorry I couldn't hold on to the shop. Your grandfather would be ashamed of me." The freezing rain offered no warm absolution. The flooded street remained completely indifferent, reflecting the yellow glow of a distant streetlight. The world was a canvas of bleak, unfeeling grey. I held the photograph for a long, agonizing eternity, studying the precise shape of Daniel's square jaw, the familiar way his bright blue eyes crinkled at the corners, the small, pale scar on his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident when he was 7. I memorized every minute visual detail, terrified that the relentless storm might wash the image away and leave me grasping nothing but a blank, empty black frame. Hot, salty tears spilled over my lower lashes, mixing instantly with the freezing rain streaking down my rough cheeks. The salt burned my cold skin, a brief, stinging reminder that the victim inside me was still bleeding. Emotion. Then, slowly, deliberately, I slid the photograph back into my wet breast pocket, pressing the hard plastic flat against my chest, right over the steady, heavy thud of my heartbeat. I buttoned the pocket shut with numb, freezing fingers. I looked up. The torrential downpour washed the thick black grease from my face in dark rivulets, carrying 30 years of slick engine oil and sweet-smelling transmission fluid off my chin and into the rushing gutter. The water was paralyzingly cold, but I did not flinch. I let it strip away the thick layer of grime that had defined my entire existence, the mechanic's dark mask, the humble tradesman's disguise, the heavy armor of quiet anonymity that I had worn for so long that I had almost forgotten the jagged, sharp edges of the man who existed underneath. My jaw tightened until my teeth ground together with a harsh crunch. The muscles in my face pulled taut, the skin hardening over the bones like wet concrete setting into solid grey stone. My eyes, washed clean by the storm, locked onto the far end of the desolate street where the padlocked garage sat in the grey distance, dark and sealed and waiting in the shadows. The crushing sorrow did not leave, it would never leave, but it was no longer the sole occupant of my hollowed chest. A terrifying, icy fury had risen beside it, something that had lain completely dormant for decades, buried beneath the quiet, peaceful life of a small-town mechanic. I stood up from the rusted metal bench, the heavy water cascaded off my broad shoulders in thick sheets. I gripped the 12-inch combination wrench in my right hand, the freezing, solid steel biting deeply into my calloused palm. My posture straightened, casting off the heavy physical burden of the victim. My breathing steadied into a slow, controlled rhythm. The violent tremor that had plagued my hands for years vanished completely. I walked forward into the blinding, freezing rain, heading toward the only refuge I had left, a cheap, forgotten neon-lit motel on Route 9, where I would immediately begin the grim, dark work of becoming the monster I had spent a lifetime trying to forget. Emotion. The cheap motel room smelled heavily of damp, rotting carpet and harsh industrial bleach, an odor that stung my nostrils and settled like a heavy stone in my stomach. The room was no larger than a storage closet, dominated entirely by a sagging queen bed covered in a stiff, mustard-yellow spread. A single fluorescent tube buzzed furiously above the bathroom door, casting a sickly, flickering light over the terrifying rebirth of a man I had spent 30 years trying to bury. I dropped my dripping jacket onto a stained plastic chair. My clothes clung to my skin, saturated with the freezing rainwater that had chilled me to the bone. The crushing grief, devastating sorrow, and profound loss of losing the garage remained. A crushing, suffocating burden and heavy weight pressing down on my sternum, but the absolute despair, deep fear, and sudden rage had been entirely replaced by a dark, chilling fear and profound tension. A terrifying anticipation coiled tightly around my spine. I stepped to the window, pulled back the edge of the heavy, smoke-stained curtain, and looked out into the parking lot. The storm still raged, the rain beating violently against the cracked asphalt. My beat-up Ford truck sat under the glow of a flickering sodium light. There was no silver sedan, no police cruisers, only the bleak, unfeeling darkness of Route 9. I closed the curtain. I knelt on the damp, terrible carpet beside the small duffel bag I had retrieved from a hidden compartment behind the Ford's passenger seat. It was a dark green military surplus bag, untouched for over 2 decades. The canvas was stiff with age and covered in a thick layer of fine dust. My calloused, grease-stained fingers grasped the heavy brass zipper. A brief, sharp tremor of hesitation ran down my arm, a final desperate protest from the humble, peaceful mechanic who had lived a quiet life. I ignored it. I pulled the zipper open with a loud, harsh screech that echoed violently in the tiny room. Inside lay a thick false bottom. I dug my fingers into the corners and tore the heavy canvas lining away. Beneath it rested a small, airtight, black pelican case. I lifted it out, the cold, heavy plastic biting into my palms. I pressed the heavy steel latches. They popped open with 2 sharp, terrifyingly loud cracks. Inside the foam padding sat 3 items: a thick, leather-bound notebook, a large bundle of crisp $100 bills wrapped in tight rubber bands, and a bulky, archaic Motorola flip phone, preserved perfectly from an era long past. I picked up the phone. The thick, dark plastic felt heavy and foreign in my calloused hand. I flipped it open, the mechanical click sounding incredibly loud in the suffocating silence of the motel room. I held down the power button. The small monochrome LCD screen flickered to life, glowing with a bright, harsh green light that illuminated the deep, terrifying furrows of my face. The battery indicator showed a full charge. The machine had been kept alive by routine maintenance, a ritual I performed once a year, every year, in the dead of night, just in case the absolute worst ever came to pass. Today, the absolute worst had finally arrived. I opened the heavy leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with long lists of names, obscure dates, and strange alphanumeric codes, written entirely in my own meticulous handwriting. These were the names of men who had owed me their lives, their fortunes, and their absolute loyalty long before I ever picked up a wrench. Some were dead, many were now immensely powerful figures moving massive amounts of capital through the veins of the nation. I turned to a specific page marked by a faded red ribbon. I traced my finger down the column of names until it rested firmly on one, Thomas Blackwood. Thomas had been a starving, desperate kid with terrifying intelligence and a mountain of crushing debt when I had pulled him out of a violent, deadly situation 30 years ago. I had funded his education, cleared his debts, and given him the foundation to build an empire. He had sworn a blood oath that if I ever called, he would answer. I typed the 12-digit international number into the archaic keypad. The loud, synthetic tones of the keys cut through the steady drumming of the rain against the motel window. I pressed the green call button and raised the heavy phone to my ear. The connection hissed and crackled with harsh static. It rang twice. Then a sharp click. Emotion. The line opened. There was no greeting, only the heavy, steady sound of breathing on the other end, waiting in absolute, terrifying silence. "The wren has left the nest," I whispered into the phone. The words carried the crushing, devastating weight of a decades-long vow completely shattered. A long, agonizing pause followed. The tension in the motel room grew incredibly dense, thick enough to suffocate a man. I tightened my grip on the plastic phone until my knuckles ached with the pressure. "Arthur," the voice on the other end finally spoke. It was deep, calm, and thick with an unmistakable, chilling reverence. "I have waited 30 years for this call. Tell me exactly what you need." "I need the complete and total destruction of Vance Properties," I said. My voice was no longer that of a humble mechanic. It was cold, sharp, and terrifyingly precise. "I want Richard Vance stripped of every asset, every account, and every ounce of dignity he possesses. I want it done methodically, and I want it done by tomorrow." "Consider it done," Thomas replied without a single fraction of hesitation. "Where are you?" I gave him the address of the motel. I snapped the flip phone shut. The green light vanished, plunging the room back into the sickly yellow glow of the buzzing fluorescent tube. The peaceful victim was officially dead. The terrifying war had begun. The grief and sorrow weighed on my hollow chest. The loss was a heavy burden, a crushing weight that brought only anger, rage, fear, and despair. I felt the ache of betrayal deep inside, as though trust and hope were dead, just the way a man faces his darkest hour. It felt like a lifetime ago. The red, blue, and green lights flashed against the metallic surface, cold and rough, amidst a loud screech and sharp smell of exhaust. The motel parking lot exploded with light. 5 pairs of headlights, blinding, halogen white, swept across the cracked asphalt in perfect synchronization, illuminating every pothole, every weed sprouting through the pavement, every rusted parking bollard. I stood at the window of room 14, my fingers pulling back the edge of the thin curtain, watching the convoy roll in. 5 armored SUVs, blacked out, windows tinted to the point of opacity, each one a Cadillac Escalade with reinforced panels and run-flat tires, filed into the lot and parked in a precise crescent formation facing my door. The engines idled for 3 seconds, then shut off in unison, plunging the lot back into the amber glow of a single functioning streetlight. Doors opened, men stepped out, 8 of them, moving with the disciplined silence of a unit that had trained together for years. They wore dark suits, not military fatigues, but the way they moved betrayed their background, scanning the perimeter, checking sightlines, positioning themselves at the corners of the building with their backs to the walls. None of them spoke, none of them needed to. The rear door of the middle SUV opened last. A man stepped out, straightening the lapels of a charcoal bespoke suit that cost more than the motel's annual revenue. He was tall, mid-60s, with silver hair combed straight back from a high forehead and a face that belonged on the cover of a financial magazine. Sharp jaw, steel grey eyes, the kind of bone structure that age refines rather than erodes. Thomas Blackwood. I opened the motel door. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the scent of wet pine from the tree line at the edge of the lot. Thomas walked toward me across the cracked asphalt, his polished Oxford shoes stepping over puddles with the unconscious precision of a man who navigated far more dangerous terrain in his daily life. He stopped 3 feet from my doorway. The amber streetlight cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his eyes. He looked at me, at my stained jeans, my flannel shirt, the cheap motel room behind me, and something moved behind his expression. Not pity, not surprise. something deeper, something that resembled reverence. Thomas Blackwood, the man whose name made boardrooms go silent, whose financial empire spanned 14 countries, whose personal security detail could have staffed a small army, bowed. Not a slight nod, not a corporate tilt of the head, a deep, deliberate bow, bending at the waist, his silver hair catching the amber light as he lowered his gaze to the asphalt. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent I could never place. British boarding school filtered through decades in Johannesburg and Hong Kong. I came the moment I received the signal. I looked at him. This was the boy I had found sleeping under a bridge in Newark in 1989, skeletal and shivering, with nothing to his name but a stolen library card and a mind that could calculate compound interest in his head. I had given him a cot in the back of the garage, 3 meals a day, and a $5,000 stake to enroll in a business program at the community college. He had turned that $5,000 into $500 million in less than 2 decades. "Come in, Thomas," I said. He straightened and stepped into the motel room. He did not comment on the stained carpet, the cracked television, or the buzzing fluorescent tube. He stood in the center of the small space, with the same composure he would have brought to a presidential suite, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on mine. "Tell me everything," he said. I sat on the edge of the bed. I told him. I told him about Richard Vance, about the buyout offer, about the inspection and the power cut. I told him about Sarah, the forged deed, the cafe meeting, the manila envelope of cash. I told him about the eviction, the padlock, the 5 minutes. I kept my voice level, recounting the facts without embellishment, the way a general delivers a field report. Thomas listened without interrupting. His jaw tightened at the mention of the forged deed. A vein pulsed in his temple when I described the eviction. When I finished, a long silence filled the room, broken only by the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. "This Richard Vance," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a register that I recognized from a different era, the voice he used when negotiations had ended and consequences had begun. "Emotion tinched your property. He used the legal system as a weapon against you, and a member of your own family assisted him." "Yes." Thomas nodded once. He reached into the breast pocket of his suit and produced a slim black phone. Modern, encrypted, nothing like the relic I had used to summon him. "I will make 3 phone calls tonight," he said. "By morning you will have a full operational briefing. Every asset Vance controls, every loan he owes, every permit he holds, every shell company hiding his debts. We will know more about his empire than he does." I picked up my father's wrench from the nightstand and placed it on the bed, beside the old Motorola. The old life and the older life, side by side. "No collateral damage," I said. "No one gets hurt who doesn't deserve it." Thomas met my gaze. A slow, controlled smile spread across his face. Not warm, not friendly, but the precise, calculated expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 30 years. "Understood, sir." He turned and walked out of the motel room, his silhouette cutting through the amber light. The SUV doors opened and closed in rapid succession. Engines roared to life. The convoy pulled out of the parking lot in the same disciplined formation it had arrived in, the headlights sweeping across the cracked asphalt one last time before disappearing into the dark. I stood in the doorway, watching the taillights fade. The wrench lay on the bed behind me, the phone lay beside it. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my shoulders felt different. Not lighter, but redistributed, shared across a network of debts and loyalties that spanned decades and continents. The mechanic's retirement was over. The grief and sorrow weighed on my hollow chest. The loss was a heavy burden, a crushing weight that brought only anger, rage, fear, and despair. I felt the ache of betrayal deep inside, as though trust and hope were dead, just the way a man faces his darkest hour. It felt like a lifetime ago. The red, blue, and green lights flashed against the metallic surface, cold and rough, amidst a loud screech and sharp smell of exhaust. The war room occupied the entire top floor of Blackwood Financial's downtown office, a space designed for crisis, not comfort. A long mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The walls were lined with digital screens, each one displaying a different data feed. Financial markets, corporate filings, property records, satellite imagery. The lighting was low, controlled, casting precise pools of illumination on the table's surface and leaving the corners of the room in deliberate shadow. Thomas had the blueprints spread across the mahogany in less than 12 hours. I stood at the head of the table, my arms crossed, studying the documents with the same focused attention I gave to an engine that refused to turn over. The difference was that this engine was made of shell companies, offshore accounts, and predatory loans, and every cylinder was about to seize. Vance Properties LLC is a house of cards, Thomas said, standing at the opposite end of the table with a laser pointer in his hand. He traced a red dot across a printed organizational chart, a web of subsidiary companies, holding entities, and numbered accounts that branched out from a central node like a diseased root system. His entire empire runs on leverage. He borrows against assets he doesn't fully own, then uses the borrowed capital to acquire more assets, which he borrows against again. The leverage ratio is approximately 18-1, meaning what, in plain terms, I asked. Meaning for every dollar of real value he controls, he owes $18 to banks, investors, and private lenders. If even one significant lender pulls their commitment, the entire structure collapses. It's not a question of whether his empire falls, it's a question of which thread we pull first. Thomas tapped the pointer on a specific box in the chart, a shell company labeled Meridian Capital Partners, registered in Delaware. This is his primary credit facility, Thomas continued. Meridian provides the revolving line of credit that funds his construction operations. The lead investor in Meridian is Pacific Rim Holdings, a Singaporean fund. He paused, a thin smile forming at the edge of his mouth. Pacific Rim's majority stakeholder is a trust that I personally administer. One phone call, and the line of credit evaporates. I studied the chart. The web of companies was dense, tangled, deliberately obscured, the financial architecture of a man who expected no one to look too closely. But when you stripped away the jargon and the jurisdictions, it was a simple machine. Money in, debt out, leverage stacked on leverage until the entire thing was balanced on a razor's edge. What about the legal angle? I asked. The forged deed, the fraudulent lien on my accounts. Thomas reached beneath the table and produced a second set of documents, thick, bound in red covers, stamped with the seal of 3 different law firms. Sarah Hayes's banking records, he said. He placed them on the table and opened to a flagged page. 3 deposits totaling $87,000 from a subsidiary of Vance Properties, routed through a payroll processing company to disguise the source. Each deposit corresponds to a specific date, the day before the inspection complaint was filed, the day before the mortgage transfer was notarized, and the day after the eviction order was issued. I looked at the numbers. $87,000. The price my daughter-in-law had accepted for my father's legacy. The figure was obscene in its modesty, not a fortune, not a windfall, but a transaction fee. She had sold me out for the cost of a mid-sized sedan. The forged signature on the mortgage transfer is sufficient for a Class C felony charge in this state, Thomas continued. Combined with the documented payments, it constitutes conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. She faces a minimum of 4 years in federal prison. I circled the mahogany table, my fingers trailing along the polished wood. I stopped in front of the organizational chart, studying the central node, Vance Properties LLC, Richard Vance, sole director. I picked up a red marker from the table and drew a single, deliberate circle around a smaller box connected to the central node. Prospect Avenue Development Corp. This is the entity that holds the stolen deed to my property, I said. This is the artery. Thomas nodded. Sever it, and the blood supply to his flagship project dies. The construction permits expire, the investors demand their capital back, the banks call in the loans, and Richard Vance is left standing in the middle of a half-built parking garage with no money, no permits, and no legal claim to the land it sits on. I set the marker down on the table. The red circle stared up at me from the white paper, a target drawn with surgical precision. Freeze everything, I said. My voice carried no anger, no triumph, no satisfaction. It was the voice of a man issuing an operational directive, flat, controlled, and absolute. Pull the credit line, file the fraud charges, serve the injunctions, and make sure there is no collateral damage. Every supplier, every subcontractor, every hourly worker on his sites gets paid in full before the walls come down. Owned straightened. He buttoned his suit jacket with a single practiced motion. Consider it done, Mr. Hayes. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the web of shell companies and stolen signatures spread across the mahogany. The cold calculation of it, the precise mechanical dismantling of an enemy who had no idea the machinery was already in motion, settled into my chest like a block of ice. There was no joy in it, there was no rage. There was only the quiet, relentless efficiency of a man who had been given no choice but to destroy. The grief was a crushing weight, the sorrow felt like a heavy burden, the fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. I watched Richard Vance's world collapse through a live surveillance feed on a 32-inch monitor, sitting in the dim quiet of Blackwood Financial's operations room, 3 floors below the war room where we had drawn the battle lines. The feed showed the rooftop terrace of the Meridian Club, an elite bar perched atop the tallest building in Millbrook's financial district. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, a panoramic view of the city skyline glittering against the night sky. Richard stood at the center of a group of 6 men in tailored suits, investors, bankers, the kind of people who measured the value of a handshake in millions. He held a champagne flute in his right hand, gesturing expansively with his left, his mouth moving in animated conversation. Even through the silent feed, I could read his body language, triumphant, expansive, basking in the glow of what he believed was his greatest acquisition. My property, my father's land. I sat in a leather chair, my elbows resting on the armrests, my fingers laced together in front of my chest. The monitor's glow was the only light in the room. Thomas stood behind me, his arms folded, his eyes on a second screen displaying a real-time financial data feed. Stock tickers, bond yields, credit default swap rates, all connected to the web of entities we had mapped the night before. The credit line was severed at 7:14 p.m., Thomas said, his voice low and controlled. Pacific Rim Holdings issued a formal withdrawal of commitment. Meridian Capital received the notice 6 minutes ago. On the rooftop feed, nothing changed. Richard was still laughing, still drinking, still performing for his audience. The news had not reached him yet. Then his phone buzzed. I watched him pull it from his breast pocket, glance at the screen, and hold up a finger to his companions. One moment. He stepped away from the group, pressing the phone to his ear. His expression shifted in stages: curiosity, confusion, irritation. He turned his back to the investors and hunched over, his free hand gripping the railing of the terrace. The second call came less than a minute later. He pulled the phone away from his ear, stared at the screen, and pressed it back with visible force. His shoulders tightened, the hand on the railing turned white-knuckled. His body language had shifted from relaxed confidence to rigid tension in the span of 60 seconds. Thomas tapped a key on the console. A third screen flickered to life, showing a stock ticker, Vance Properties Holdings, the public vehicle for his development projects. The line was flat, steady, boring. Then at 7:22 p.m., the line broke. A massive sell order, triggered by the automated margin calls that followed the credit line withdrawal, sent the price into freefall. Red numbers cascaded down the screen in a waterfall of collapsing value. -4%, -8, -12. The margin calls are hitting his personal guarantees, Thomas said. His broker will liquidate his positions within the hour. On the rooftop, Richard was no longer on the phone. He was staring at his screen, at the same numbers I was watching, the same red cascade, the same waterfall. His face had drained of color, the tan complexion turning a sickly, washed-out gray under the harsh chandeliers. The champagne flute in his right hand began to tremble. The investors were watching him now. One by one, their relaxed postures stiffened. Conversations died, smiles faded. The body language of the group shifted from camaraderie to suspicion in real time, the way a pack of animals senses weakness in one of its own. Richard turned back to face them. He opened his mouth. I could see his lips moving, forming words that were almost certainly reassurances, explanations, deflections. But his hands were shaking, his eyes were darting. The mask of the confident developer was cracking in real time, splitting apart like dry plaster under pressure. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers. It hit the stone terrace and shattered with a sharp, bright sound that the surveillance microphone captured as a tinny pop through the monitor's speakers. The amber liquid splashed across the polished stone, spreading in a dark stain. The investors began to move. One pulled out his phone. Another whispered to the man beside him. A third simply stood up and walked toward the exit without a word. They were distancing themselves, the instinctive retreat of men who recognized a sinking ship and had no intention of going down with it. Richard stood alone on the rooftop terrace, surrounded by empty chairs and the shattered remains of his champagne glass. His phone rang again. He did not answer it. I sat in the dark operations room, my fingers still laced, my expression unchanged. The monitor cast pale blue light across my face. Thomas stood behind me, silent, waiting. The first strike had landed, clean, precise, devastating. And Richard Vance had no idea where it had come from. I reached over and turned off the monitor. The room went dark. Phase 2, I said. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough, metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. Suddenly, the silence faded to black. Abruptly, what happens next became completely unknown. Before I could move, the impossible happened without warning. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. The second feed came in the next morning. Thomas had positioned a discreet surveillance team at 3 locations Sarah frequented: her gym, her favorite brunch spot, and the upscale boutique on Madison Avenue where she spent money like it was a competitive sport. The feed was routed to a tablet propped on the desk beside my coffee. I watched her walk into the boutique at 10:47 a.m., her designer bag swinging from one arm, her chin tilted at the angle of someone who expected the world to arrange itself around her arrival. She browsed the racks with the casual authority of a repeat customer, pulling garments from hangers and draping them over her arm without checking prices. A timid young clerk trailed behind her, nodding at everything she said. Sarah stopped at a display case near the back, leather handbags, the kind that came with brass clasps and waiting lists. She pointed at a black crocodile skin piece behind the glass. The clerk unlocked the case, lifted the bag with both hands, and placed it on the counter. Sarah inspected it with the critical eye of a jeweler examining a stone, then nodded. The clerk rang it up. Sarah produced her platinum card, the one funded by the $87,000 routed through Vance Properties' payroll subsidiary, and slid it across the counter. The terminal beeped. The clerk's face tightened. She swiped the card again. The same beep, harsh, final, unmistakable. The word "EC aligned" flashed in red letters on the small screen. Sarah's composure didn't break immediately. She smiled, the stiff, controlled smile of someone who was certain the mistake belonged to the machine, not to her. She reached into her bag and produced a second card, gold, from a different bank. The clerk swiped it, declined. A third card, declined. Emotion. A fourth, a credit card from a department store chain, declined. The color drained from her face in stages, like water receding from a shoreline. Her smile collapsed, her jaw tightened. She began tapping the screen of her phone with frantic, stabbing gestures, pulling up her banking app. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened, then closed. She tapped again, switching between accounts, checking, savings, the joint account she had opened with the Vance money. Every balance read the same number, $0.00. The clerk behind the counter shifted on her feet, her eyes darting toward the back of the store. Sarah's breathing quickened, her chest rising and falling in visible, shallow bursts. The designer bag slid off her arm and hit the polished floor with a muted thud. She did not pick it up. "Ma'am," the clerk ventured, "is there another form of payment you'd like to?" "There's been a mistake," Sarah said. Her voice cracked on the last syllable. "This is a mistake. My accounts are, there's been some kind of freeze. I need to call my bank." A security guard, a broad-shouldered man in a black polo, appeared at the end of the aisle. He stood with his arms folded, his expression neutral, but his presence unmistakable. The universal signal that a transaction had gone wrong and the establishment preferred a quiet departure. Sarah looked at the guard, then at the clerk, then at the crocodile skin bag sitting on the counter. She grabbed her phone and her fallen designer bag and walked toward the exit with rapid, unsteady steps, her heels clicking an erratic rhythm against the marble floor. She did not look back. She pushed through the glass door and stumbled onto the sidewalk, pressing her phone to her ear with a shaking hand. Emotion. I turned off the tablet. I set it face down on the desk and picked up my coffee. The liquid was lukewarm bitter, exactly the way I made it at the shop. I drank it in slow, measured sips. There was no satisfaction in watching Sarah's world implode. The familial bond, the obligation I had carried for my dead son's sake, was severed. She was not my daughter-in-law anymore. She was not a person I mourned or pitied or despised. She was an equation that had been unbalanced, and the correction was a mathematical certainty, not an emotional event. I set the empty mug on the desk and stared at the dark tablet screen. The reflection showed my own face, older, harder, stripped of the grease that had once defined it. A grim sense of justice settled into my chest, heavy and cold, like a stone dropped into still water. The debt of humiliation was being paid. Not with rage, not with screaming, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a system turning against the people who had abused it. Phase 2 was complete. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible weight in the dark. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. Sarah burst through the front door of my old house at 6:14 p.m., slamming it against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster behind the doorknob. I heard her heels hammering down the hallway, heard the frantic rhythm of her breathing, heard the sharp intake of air as she rounded the corner into the kitchen and stopped dead. I was sitting at the kitchen table. The room was empty, stripped bare of furniture, pictures, curtains. The refrigerator hummed against the far wall, the only appliance I had not yet disconnected. A single overhead bulb cast a harsh, flat light over the worn linoleum floor. In front of me, centered on the table, sat a thick legal dossier bound in dark blue covers. "What did you do?" Sarah's voice came out as a ragged whisper. She stood in the doorway, her designer bag hanging limply from one hand, her face blotchy and streaked with mascara. Her hair had come loose from its ponytail, falling across her forehead in tangled strands. The composure, the calculated sweetness, the brisk efficiency, all of it was gone, replaced by the raw, unfiltered panic of a woman who had watched her safety net disintegrate in the span of 24 hours. "Sit down, Sarah," I said. She didn't sit. She took 3 steps into the kitchen, her heels clacking against the bare linoleum, and planted both hands on the table. "My accounts are frozen," she said. Her voice climbed in pitch with each word. "Every single one. My credit cards are dead. The bank told me there's a federal investigation, a fraud investigation, and they froze everything pending a subpoena. What did you do?" I slid the blue dossier across the table toward her. She stared at it, her chest heaving, then snatched it up and flipped it open. The first page was a timeline, 3 dates, 3 deposits, 3 amounts, $22,000, $35,000, $30,000, each linked to a specific event: the filing of the inspection complaint, the notarization of the forged mortgage transfer, the issuance of the eviction order. Each deposit was traced, through 3 layers of payroll processing companies, directly to a subsidiary of Vance Properties LLC. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. Her eyes scanned the text, catching on highlighted passages, wire transfer confirmations, bank routing numbers, notarized affidavits from Vance's former payroll manager. "You took money from the people trying to steal my property," I said. My voice was level, clinical, stripped of any inflection that might be mistaken for anger or grief. 3 payments, $87,000, each one timed to coincide with a specific act against me. Sarah looked up from the dossier. Her eyes were wide, glistening, searching my face for something. Mercy, maybe, or the familiar warmth of the man who had kept her fed and housed after Daniel died. She found neither. "But that's not the worst of it," I continued. I reached across the table and turned to a flagged page near the back of the dossier. The flag was red. The page displayed a high-resolution scan of the forged mortgage transfer, the same document I had found in my filing cabinet. "Your forged signature on the mortgage transfer doesn't just void the sale," I said. "It triggers an automatic criminal referral under the state's real estate fraud statute. Class C felony, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, minimum sentence, 4 years in federal custody. The dossier slipped from Sarah's hands. It hit the table with a heavy slap, scattering loose pages across the bare surface. She took a step backward, her heel catching on the edge of the linoleum, and stumbled. "Dad," she started. "Don't," I said. The word came out sharp, final, a door slamming shut. "Don't call me that. You lost the right to call me that the day you signed my name on a piece of paper and handed my father's property to a stranger." Sarah's knees buckled. She sank to the kitchen floor, her designer bag pooling around her like a deflated parachute, her hands pressed flat against the cold linoleum, her fingers splayed, her nails, once manicured, now chipped, scratching against the worn surface. "Please," she whispered. "Please, I was desperate. The debts were crushing me, Danny's medical bills." I stood up from the table, the chair scraped against the floor with a sharp squeal. I looked down at her, at the woman my son had loved, crumpled on the kitchen floor of the house where we had once been a family. The grief was there, buried deep, a dull ache that would never fully dissolve, but it was encased in something harder now, something impenetrable. I walked past her. My boots stepped over her outstretched hand without pausing. I did not look back. I did not offer a hand. I did not say another word. The front door closed behind me with a soft click. The evening air was cool and clean. I walked to the waiting SUV at the curb, climbed into the back seat, and closed the door. "Phase 3, I said. Thomas nodded from the driver's seat and pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the old house shrank until it was a small, dark shape against the fading sky. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough, metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. Suddenly, the silence faded to black. Abruptly, what happens next became completely unknown. Before I could move, the impossible happened without warning. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. Richard Vance looked nothing like the man who had walked into my garage 3 weeks ago. The tailored navy suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled grey shirt with the collar unbuttoned and dark half-moons of sweat staining the underarms. His styled hair was disheveled, strands falling across a forehead glistening with perspiration. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, darted between surfaces with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. I watched him through a one-way mirror in the adjacent conference room of Blackwood Financial's executive floor. The glass was seamless, indistinguishable from a wall panel on Richard's side. Thomas had designed it for exactly this kind of observation, negotiations where the true decision-maker preferred to remain invisible. Richard had arrived 45 minutes ago, barging past the reception desk and demanding to see whoever runs this place. 2 security personnel had escorted him to the executive conference room, where Thomas met him with the polished courtesy of a man extending a hand to a drowning swimmer. "Mr. Vance," Thomas had said, settling into a chair across from him with deliberate slowness. "I understand you're experiencing some cash flow challenges." "Cash flow challenges," Richard repeated, the words coming out in a strained bark. "My credit lines are gone, every single one. Pacific Rim pulled their commitment, your fund, your people, and now every bank in the state is calling in their notes. I need a bridge loan, 40 million, 90 days. I can restructure the entire portfolio and repay at prime +3. Thomas leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, the portrait of a reluctant savior weighing his options. 40 million is a significant commitment, Mr. Vance, Thomas said, especially given the current volatility surrounding your assets. However, Blackwood Financial does maintain a discretionary fund for extraordinary situations. Richard leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. His knuckles were white, a vein pulsed in his temple. "Name your terms," he said. Thomas opened a leather portfolio and slid a thick stack of documents across the table. The pages were dense with legal language, clause after clause of impenetrable corporate jargon, collateral assignments, personal guarantees, subordination agreements, automatic acceleration triggers. It was a contract designed by three of the finest legal minds Thomas employed, and every clause was a trap. The terms are aggressive, I won't deny it, Thomas said, his voice carrying the measured sympathy of a surgeon explaining a difficult procedure. Full collateral pledge against all Vance Properties assets, including subsidiary holdings, personal guarantee against your primary residence and any vehicles titled in your name, and a conversion clause, standard for distressed lending, that allows Blackwood Financial to convert the debt to equity in the event of a covenant breach. Richard's lawyer, a thin man in wire-rimmed glasses who had arrived with him, reached for the documents. We need to review these terms in detail before, the lawyer started. No, Richard snapped. He slammed his palm on the table. I don't have time for a line-by-line review. My investors are pulling out today. If I don't have liquidity by close of business, the entire project collapses. He turned to Thomas. Where do I sign? The lawyer hesitated. His mouth opened, then closed. He adjusted his glasses, looked at the stack of documents, and made one more attempt. Richard, I strongly advise. I heard you. Richard's voice was raw, stripped of every layer of arrogance and entitlement that had once defined it. He was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only hand reaching out belonged to the person who had pushed him there. Give me the pen. Thomas produced a gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and set it on the table. The pen caught the overhead light, gleaming against the dark wood. Richard picked it up. His hand was shaking, a visible, uncontrollable tremor that made the pen rattle against the paper. He flipped to the signature page, pressed the nib to the line, and signed his name. The strokes were jagged, uneven, the handwriting of a man whose entire nervous system was in revolt. He signed the second page, the third, the fourth, each signature a nail driven into the coffin of his own empire. In Salme BF's priester. I stood behind the one-way glass, my arms folded across my chest, watching Richard Vance sign away everything he owned to a man who would hand it all to me. The gold-plated pen scratched against the paper with a sound that carried through the glass. Thin, precise, and final. Richard set the pen down and looked at Thomas with the desperate, hollow expression of a man who had just gambled everything on a single hand. The funds will be transferred within the hour, Thomas said. He gathered the signed documents with careful, practiced hands, aligning the pages with the precise attention of a man filing away a weapon. Richard nodded. He stood up on unsteady legs, buttoned his wrinkled shirt with fumbling fingers, and turned toward the door. Behind the glass, I watched him leave. The gold-plated pen lay on the table. The documents were signed. The trap was sealed. Richard Vance had just signed his entire empire over to the mechanic he had evicted from a garage 3 weeks ago. He just didn't know it yet. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. Suddenly, the silence faded to black. Abruptly, what happens next became completely unknown. Before I could move, the impossible happened without warning. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. The scratch of the fountain pen against heavy parchment echoed in the silent boardroom, like the tick of a countdown clock reaching zero. Richard Vance had signed the final page of the bailout contract less than 10 minutes ago. He sat in the leather chair, his wrinkled grey shirt clinging to his chest, his face carrying the exhausted relief of a man who believed he had just been pulled from the edge of a cliff. Thomas Blackwood gathered the signed documents into a neat stack. He aligned the edges with precise, mechanical taps against the mahogany table, then slid them into a leather portfolio and fastened the clasp. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face, not wide, not triumphant, but thin and controlled, the expression of a chess player who had been waiting 47 moves for this exact position. Richard watched the smile form. Something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker, a tremor of doubt, but he said nothing. Thomas straightened his cuffs. He reached across the table and pressed a small brass button recessed into the wood. An intercom built into the conference table's surface. The acquisition is complete, Mr. Hayes, Thomas said into the intercom. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the formal cadence of a subordinate delivering a status report to his superior. Richard's head snapped toward Thomas. The color drained from his face in a single violent rush, as if someone had pulled a plug at the base of his skull and let the blood fall. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Behind him, the heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom began to open. The hinges moved with slow, deliberate precision, producing a low, grinding creak that filled the silent room. A shaft of light from the corridor beyond fell across the polished floor in a widening beam. I stepped through the doorway. I was wearing the same grease-stained blue jumpsuit from the day we met, the same one I had worn every working day of my life at 417 Prospect Avenue. The fabric was faded, the collar frayed, the chest pocket bearing a stitched name tag that read Hayes in block letters. My work boots, heavy, scarred, steel-toed, struck the polished hardwood floor with a sound that had nothing in common with the tentative shuffle of a beaten man. I walked with the measured, unhurried stride of someone entering a room he already owned. Richard stared at me, his jaw hung open. His eyes, wide, bloodshot, rimmed with the purple shadows of sleepless nights, tracked my approach across the room with the paralyzed focus of a man watching a ghost materialize from thin air. "You," he started. The word came out cracked, broken, a fragment of a sentence that his brain could not complete. I walked to the head of the table. I did not sit down. Emotions. I placed both hands on the polished mahogany surface and leaned forward, bringing my face level with his. The distance between us was less than 3 feet, close enough to see the fine lines of panic carved into his skin, the beads of sweat rolling down his temples, the rapid pulse hammering in the hollow of his throat. "You came into my garage," I said. My voice was quiet. Not a whisper, quiet. The kind of quiet that fills a room more than any shout, pressing into every corner, leaving no space for response. "You insulted my work, you threatened my property, you weaponized the city against me, you froze my accounts, you forged my signature, and you evicted me from the building my father built with his bare hands." I paused. I let each sentence land, watching the impact register on Richard's face like hammer blows driving nails into soft wood. "You did all of that," I continued, "because you looked at a man in a mechanic's jumpsuit and saw a target, a relic, something small and powerless that you could crush on your way to something bigger." I straightened. I looked down at him, at the wrinkled shirt, the trembling hands, the deflated posture of a man who had just realized that the bug he had been trying to step on was in fact the boot. "You didn't just lose your company, Richard," I said. "Every asset, every building, every penny of equity you signed over 10 minutes ago now belongs to me. Your flagship project, your construction permits, your downtown properties, the penthouse you sleep in, the car you drove here, all of it." Richard's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. His knuckles were white, his jaw trembled. He looked at Thomas, searching for a lifeline, a contradiction, a sign that this was some kind of elaborate bluff. Thomas stood at the side of the table, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression serene. He offered nothing. Richard turned back to me. Emotion. His mouth opened and closed. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his collar. "You can't," he started. "I already did," I said. "You signed the conversion clause yourself. Every word, every page, every signature. Your lawyer warned you. You ignored him." Richard slumped in his chair. The rigid posture, the squared shoulders, the last remnants of the arrogant developer who had swaggered into my garage, all of it collapsed inward, folding in on itself like a building stripped of its load-bearing walls. His head dropped forward, his shoulders shook. A sound emerged from deep in his chest, a ragged, wet, gasping sound that might have been a sob or might have been the last breath of a man who had just watched his entire identity crumble to dust. I stood at the head of the table, looking down at the man who had tried to destroy me. There was no satisfaction in his tears, no thrill of victory. There was only the cold, final certainty that the debt had been paid and the equation was balanced. I turned and walked out of the boardroom, my work boots marking a steady rhythm against the polished floor. Behind me, the mahogany doors swung shut with a heavy, decisive thud. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. Suddenly, the silence faded to black. Abruptly, what happens next became completely unknown. Before I could move, the impossible happened without warning. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. The grand reveal had played out behind closed doors, but the aftermath, the public, visceral, undeniable aftermath, I chose to witness in person. Thomas had handled the legal mechanics with the same surgical precision he brought to everything. The conversion clause was triggered, the asset transfer was filed with the county recorder's office before close of business, and the eviction proceedings against Richard Vance were initiated through the same court system that had been used against me, the same judge, the same deputies, the same padlock. I sat in the back seat of Thomas's armored SUV, parked across the street from Richard's downtown mansion, a sprawling 3-story colonial revival with white columns and a circular driveway, tucked behind a wrought iron gate on the most exclusive block in Millbrook. The tinted windows reduced the world outside to a dim, muted palette of greys and blues. The same police cruisers that had blocked the entrance to my garage 3 weeks ago now idled in Richard's driveway. 3 of them, their red and blue lights spinning in the early morning drizzle, painting the white columns in alternating strokes. A moving truck, large, unmarked, was backed up to the front door, its ramp lowered. Movers, court-appointed, indifferent, working on the clock, carried Richard's possessions out of the mansion and deposited them on the front lawn. Original oil paintings in gilded frames, custom-made Italian leather sofas, a crystal chandelier removed from the foyer ceiling and wrapped in a moving blanket. Designer suits on wooden hangers, still sheathed in dry cleaning plastic, tossed into a growing pile on the wet grass. A collection of vintage wine bottles, some of them worth thousands, stacked in a cardboard box set carelessly on the muddy ground. Richard stood on the front steps of his former home, flanked by 2 deputies. He wore the same wrinkled grey shirt from the boardroom. He had not changed, had not slept, had not eaten. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow, his posture stooped under the weight of a devastation he could not process. He watched the movers strip his life bare with the numb, dissociated stare of a man watching a car accident in slow motion. I pressed the button on the armrest, and the tinted window lowered 3 inches, just enough to let the cool morning air stream across my face, and just enough for my eyes to become visible to anyone looking in the right direction. Richard looked up. His gaze swept across the street, aimless, unfocused, and stopped on the SUV. He stared at the narrow gap in the tinted window. His body went rigid, his mouth opened. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if an invisible wall had materialized between us. He could see my face. He knew. I held his gaze for 3 seconds, long enough to be unmistakable, short enough to deny him the dignity of a response. Then I pressed the button, and the window rose, sealing me back behind the tinted glass. "Drive," I said. Thomas pulled the SUV away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, I watched Richard Vance standing on the front steps of his empty mansion, his arms hanging at his sides, his wrinkled shirt darkening with rain. The movers continued their work around him, carrying his life to the curb with the mechanical indifference of men who did this every day. The drizzle turned to rain. Richard stood in it. He did not move. He did not go inside. He stood there, surrounded by the scattered, soaking remains of his possessions, the paintings fading in the wet, the leather sofas absorbing water, the vintage wine bottles sitting in puddles of mud, and stared at the empty street where the SUV had been. A grim, profound satisfaction settled into my chest. Not joy, not triumph, something deeper and more permanent, the bone-deep recognition that the scales had been balanced, that the debt of humiliation had been repaid in full, in exactly the same currency it had been issued. He had evicted me from my father's garage in front of armed deputies. Now he stood in the rain, watching strangers dismantle his palace with the same cold efficiency. The equation was balanced, the blood debt was repaid, the grief was a crushing weight, emotion. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. The long, heavy night dragged on relentlessly. I sat in the darkness, waiting for the dawn to arrive. Every passing second felt like a lifetime. The cold air filled the empty room, offering no comfort to my exhausted body. I knew the coming days would be the hardest test of my entire existence. The shadows danced on the walls, a silent reflection of the turbulent war raging within my mind. There was no escape from the path I had chosen. The silence was deafening, pressing down on my shoulders with the weight of inevitable destiny. The long, heavy night dragged on relentlessly. I sat in the darkness, waiting for the dawn to arrive. Every passing, the grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next, however, only time will tell. The rain persisted through the afternoon, turning Millbrook's streets into slick ribbons of grey. I had Thomas drive me back to Prospect Avenue after the eviction. The padlocked gates of my father's garage stood exactly as they had been left, chained, sealed, tagged with the city's violation stickers. But the stickers had been officially rescinded that morning. The inspection complaints had been withdrawn. The violation orders had been vacated by the same judge who had issued them, once the forged mortgage transfer was entered into evidence. Thomas's crew removed the padlock with a bolt cutter. The chain rattled free and hit the wet concrete with a metallic clatter. The rolling steel door groaned open, revealing the dark, silent interior of the bay. The smell of old motor oil, stale air, and cold metal rolled out in a wave that hit me like a physical force. I stepped inside. The hydraulic lift stood frozen where it had died 3 weeks ago. The air compressor was silent. My father's tool chest sat against the far wall, untouched, the red craftsman paint catching the grey light from the open door. The Mustang was still there, patient and unfinished, its engine compartment open like a surgical patient waiting on the table. I walked to the main power panel on the eastern wall. I flipped the master breaker. The fluorescent tubes buzzed, flickered, and burst to life, flooding the bay with harsh, familiar light. The air compressor coughed once, twice, then settled into its steady rhythmic hum, the heartbeat of the shop, restored. I stood in the light and listened to the compressor hum. The sound filled the space the way it had filled every working day of my life. Constant, reliable, a white noise that meant everything was operational, everything was alive. The work began immediately, emotion. Thomas arranged for a full renovation of the building, new wiring, upgraded fire suppression, reinforced structural supports, all completed in 10 days by a crew that worked around the clock. New steel security gates replaced the old rolling door, heavy and thick, with electronic locks and a surveillance system that covered every angle. The yellow violation stickers were scraped from the windows and replaced with clean, clear glass. But I kept the sign, Hayes Auto Repair, the same sign my father had hung with 3 bent nails from the roof of his Ford Bronco. Thomas offered to have it professionally restored. I told him to leave it as it was. The faded paint and the crooked R were part of the story. I did not go back to the old house. I had it listed for sale through one of Thomas's agents. The proceeds would cover the legal fees and leave enough to endow a small scholarship fund in Daniel's name at the community college where Thomas had once enrolled. The circle closed itself. The days settled into a new rhythm. Mornings at the shop, elbows deep in engines, afternoons on the phone with Thomas, reviewing the disposition of Vance Properties' former assets, the construction projects completed by new contractors, the workers paid in full, the debts restructured. I had no interest in becoming a real estate developer. I instructed Thomas to liquidate the commercial holdings and funnel the proceeds into the same network of trusts and foundations that had been waiting, dormant, for 15 years. The city moved on. Richard Vance's name disappeared from the business pages. I heard, through Thomas who monitored these things, that he had moved to a studio apartment in a different state. No firm would hire him, no bank would lend to him. The fraud investigation ground forward at its own bureaucratic pace. Sarah's case was faster. The forgery charges were filed within a week. She was arraigned, released on her own recognizance, and assigned a public defender. I received no calls from her. I expected none. The shop was quiet. The machines hummed. The tools hung in their slots. The world outside the steel gates went about its business, unaware that the mechanic working under the hood of a 1968 Mustang had, for a brief and violent season, reminded certain people of something they had been encouraged to forget. The old life and the older life had merged, and what remained was something neither peaceful nor violent, but permanent. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough, metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. It was a heavy burden, one that I would carry until the very end of my days. Emotion. The surveillance feed from the security cameras showed her arriving at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was in the back office, reviewing an invoice for replacement gaskets, when the motion sensor triggered a soft chime on the new monitoring system. Sarah stood outside the massive steel security gates of the renovated shop, dragging a cheap plastic suitcase behind her with one hand. The suitcase was scuffed and dirty, one of its wheels broken, leaving a thin scrape mark on the sidewalk. She wore the same cream-colored blouse from the day she had come to the garage with the buyout folder, but it was wrinkled now, stained at the collar, the fabric hanging loose on a frame that had lost weight in the weeks since her accounts were frozen. Her designer heels were ruined, the soles cracked, the leather peeling at the seams, and she walked with the unsteady gait of someone who had been on her feet for too long. She stopped at the gate. She stood there for a long moment, her free hand rising to the cold steel surface, her fingers pressing flat against the metal. The security lights, bright, white, unforgiving, illuminated every line of exhaustion on her face, every shadow under her eyes, every strand of hair that had come loose from the ponytail she no longer bothered to maintain. She pulled out her phone. I watched her dial a number, my number, presumably. The phone in the office did not ring. I had changed the number the day after the confrontation in the kitchen. She tried another number, then another. Her thumb moved across the screen with increasing speed, scrolling through a contact list, pressing call buttons, pressing them again. Each time, the phone returned to the home screen after a few seconds. No one answered, no one called back. She lowered the phone, she looked at the gate. The new Hayes Auto Repair sign, my father's original, faded and crooked, hung above the entrance, illuminated by a spotlight that Thomas had insisted on installing. The old sign in new light. Sarah's face crumpled. The controlled composure, the calculated pragmatism, the brisk efficiency that had defined every interaction I had ever had with her, all of it dissolved in the white glare of the security lights. Her chin trembled, her eyes squeezed shut. She pressed her forehead against the cold steel gate and wept, a raw, ugly, gasping sound that the security microphone picked up as a series of distorted, crackling bursts. I watched the feed for 30 seconds. I watched her shoulders shake. I watched the cheap suitcase tip over beside her, its broken wheels spinning in the air. I watched her slide down the face of the gate until she was sitting on the cold concrete, her back against the steel, her ruined heels splayed out in front of her, weeping alone in the sprawling, indifferent city. I turned off the monitor. I did not go to the gate. I did not open the door. I did not acknowledge her presence. The woman on the other side of the steel was a ghost, a remnant of a family that had been destroyed by greed and calculation, and the casual betrayal of a bond that should have been sacred. I picked up the gasket invoice, signed the order form, and placed it in the outgoing tray. The air compressor hummed, the fluorescent lights buzzed, the shop was alive, warm, operational. Outside, in the cold, Sarah sat against the gate and wept until the security system's motion sensor timed out and the lights went dark. The grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. Suddenly, the silence faded to black. Emotion. Abruptly, what happens next became completely unknown. Before I could move, the impossible happened without warning. The long, heavy night dragged on relentlessly. I sat in the darkness, waiting for the dawn to arrive. Every passing second felt like a lifetime. The cold air filled the empty room, offering no comfort to my exhausted body. I knew the coming days would be the hardest test of my entire existence. The shadows danced on the walls, a silent reflection of the turbulent war raging within my mind. There was no escape from the path I had chosen. The silence was deafening, pressing down on my shoulders with the weight of inevitable destiny. The long, heavy night dragged on relentlessly. I sat in the darkness, waiting for the dawn to arrive. Every passing second felt like a lifetime. The cold air filled the empty room, offering no comfort to my exhausted body. I knew the coming days would be the hardest test of my entire existence. The shadows danced on the walls, a silent reflection of the turbulent war raging within my mind. There was no escape from the path I had chosen. The silence was deafening, pressing down on my shoulders with the weight of inevitable destiny. The long, heavy night, the grief was a crushing weight. The sorrow felt like a heavy burden. The fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache, as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. What happens next? However, only time will tell. The morning sun broke through the freshly cleaned windows of the renovated shop, casting long, warm beams of golden light across the polished concrete floor. The dust motes were gone, the grime was gone, the yellow violation stickers were gone. In their place, the clean glass framed a view of Prospect Avenue waking up to another ordinary Tuesday. Delivery trucks rolling past, a coffee shop opening its doors across the street, a jogger disappearing around the corner. I stood at the engine bay, my sleeves rolled to the elbows, my hands wrapped around the familiar weight of a torque wrench. The 1968 Mustang sat on the hydraulic lift in front of me, its hood propped open, its rebuilt engine gleaming under the fluorescent lights. I had finished the restoration the night before, every gasket sealed, every valve adjusted, every bolt torqued to spec. The engine was a work of art. Chrome headers, polished intake manifold, a carburetor rebuilt from scratch with original matching numbers parts that had taken me 6 months to source. I leaned into the engine compartment and tightened the final bolt on the valve cover. A quarter turn, just enough to feel the resistance settle. The metal sang under the wrench, a clear, high-pitched note that meant the seal was true. I wiped a fresh smear of oil from my knuckles with a shop rag, leaving a dark streak across the worn fabric. The radio sat on the workbench beside me, an old transistor unit, the same one my father had listened to while he worked. I reached over and turned the dial. Classic rock crackled to life through the small speaker, the opening guitar riff of a song I had heard 1,000 times, a song that sounded like summer and gasoline and the simple, uncomplicated joy of building something with your hands. I hummed along. The melody vibrated in my chest, mingling with the steady hum of the air compressor and the distant rumble of traffic. The shop smelled of fresh motor oil, clean metal, and the faint sweetness of the coffee brewing in the back office. At 8:47 a.m., a black SUV, Thomas's Escalade, rolled past the front of the shop. The tinted windows reflected the morning sun, turning the vehicle into a moving mirror. It did not stop, it did not slow down. But as it passed the open bay door, the rear passenger window lowered an inch, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of Thomas Blackwood in the back seat, his silver hair catching the light, his face angled toward the shop. He gave me a nod, small, subtle, the kind of acknowledgement that exists between two men who have been through a war together and no longer need words to communicate its meaning. I returned it with a slight smile, not wide, not triumphant, just a small upward curve at the corner of my mouth. A mechanic greeting an old friend. The window rose, the SUV turned the corner and disappeared into the morning traffic. the world continued to move. I turned back to the Mustang. I picked up a clean shop rag, white cotton, freshly laundered, and wiped the last fingerprint from the chrome air filter housing. The metal reflected my face, older, harder, marked by the recent weeks in ways that would never fully fade. But the eyes looking back at me were calm, settled. The eyes of a man who had defended his territory, paid his debts, and returned to the only work that had ever made him whole. I tossed the rag onto the workbench, reached over, and turned up the radio. The guitar solo filled the garage, bouncing off the brick walls and the steel beams and the polished concrete floor. I picked up a socket wrench and leaned back into the engine compartment of the next car in the queue, a '72 Chevelle with a blown head gasket, and got back to work. The sun climbed higher, the coffee steamed in the back office, the compressor hummed, the radio played. And Arthur Hayes, mechanic of 417 Prospect Avenue, stood in his father's shop with grease on his hands and peace in his bones, fundamentally unchanged in his desires but perfectly secure in his hard-won, absolute and irreversible peace, emotion. The grief was a crushing weight, the sorrow felt like a heavy burden, the fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. Without warning, the silence broke before I could process what happens next. It was an unknown, impossible wait in the dark. The long, heavy night dragged on relentlessly. I sat in the darkness, waiting for the dawn to arrive. Every passing second felt like a lifetime. The cold air filled the empty room, offering no comfort to my exhausted body. I knew the coming days would be the hardest test of my entire existence. The shadows danced on the walls, a silent reflection of the turbulent war raging within my mind. There was no escape from the path I had chosen. The silence was deafening, pressing down on my shoulders with the weight of inevitable destiny. The long, heavy night dragged on relentlessly. I sat in the grief was a crushing weight, the sorrow felt like a heavy burden, the fear and rage mixed into despair, creating a deep ache as if hope was hollow and lost. Betrayal brought shame and guilt, the way a dark shadow consumes the light. The bright neon blue and flashing red lights reflected off the cold, rough metallic surface, smelling strongly of sweet ozone and bitter exhaust smoke amid the loud roar. But was it really gone forever? I stood in the empty room, wondering if the secret truth would ever be revealed, or if it was dead and vanished like nothing at all. Emotion. What happens next? However, only time will tell.